I carry within me the child of God. That is where it all began. The words of one foolish woman determined the course of my entire life. Before I was even born, my fate was decided. Did her claim come from faith? Was it her way of escaping reality? Or did she do it for money or fame? I don't know. I have been visited by an angel of the Lord. The village where she lived had suffered from years of poor harvest. It had been months since the last rain, and all the villagers prayed desperately to be blessed with succor. I don't actually know how to pronounce that word. Succor? I don't think so. I am with child, though I have known no man. So proclaimed the pregnant woman in the midst of the drought. And on the day of my birth, the very moment I let out my first cry, a heavy rain fell down upon the village. The storm quenched the parched earth, nourished the crops, and saved the village. The villagers were astounded, for they had thought the drought would never end. As plump drops of rain poured down upon the earth, they gathered around newborn me in exultation. Ah, she is the child of God! Perhaps there would be more wonder in claiming I had magical powers. Perhaps it would make a better story if they were to say there were higher forces involved. But all these years later, here is what I truly think. It was nothing more than a fluke, an improbable stroke of luck, an unbelievably fortunate accident for my mother in the village, and an indescribably unfortunate accident for myself. I am with child, though I have known no man. As if that's even possible. Maybe she had fooled around with a man who had gone and abandoned her, and she spouted those lies to convince herself it had never happened. None of the village men made any claim to be my father. Perhaps she was someone else's husband, and as such, he couldn't reveal himself, as adultery is a sin in the eyes of God. The girl they were praising as the child of God was, indeed, not more than the ordinary daughter of a wretched woman. At the time, though, I thought differently. I believed my mother's words, convinced I was a saint, and it gave me a sense of duty, of purpose, rather than superiority. As the daughter of God, I believed it was my responsibility to help anyone in need. So every day I prayed. I asked my Father what I could do, what I was meant to do. Not everyone is equally good, however. There will always be someone who lends their ear to the devil's whispers. One man claimed I was the daughter of a charlatan. He shouted for all to hear, "If you really are the child of God, then perform a miracle for us." Could he have been any more unreasonable? Miracles are neither magic nor parlor tricks. They are realized through the power of faith. A lowly villager has no place demanding God prove his own divinity. It is the height of arrogance. But the man refused to heed my words. So, having no other choice, I contemplated what I could do to show him I was indeed a saint. And blood was the spark of my inspiration. Michel, the time when I lived and the time when you lived were not so different. Our views and beliefs about the world are very much the same. So you should understand that in our time, blood was seen as unclean. It was a dreadful thing, ridden with diseases, which is why we drained the blood from animals and purified the and purified the flesh before consuming it. That's something we still do today, Morgana. But being a saint, my blood would have been different. Like the blood of the saints who came before me, mine would be blessed. I believed it would be able to cleanse the people's impurities. For my demonstration, I chose an elderly woman afflicted with a terrible disease. She was on her deathbed, and no one thought she would live longer than another day or two. The woman was overjoyed when I came to visit her. Sincerely believing me to be a holy servant of the Lord, she gathered all the strength she could muster to climb from her bed and kiss my feet. I felt an intensely deep love for this woman. Placing my hands upon her cheeks, I said with all the kindness in my heart, "My beloved sister, partake of my blood." The woman agreed without a glimpse of hesitation, and so I pricked the tip of my finger with a knife and let the blood drip into her mouth. Within 3 days, her health had improved enough for her to get out of bed unassisted. Seeing that, no one in the village doubted my powers any longer. In fact, the man who had accused me of being the daughter of a charlatan was subsequently punished for his sins. He received much deserved retribution for challenging the daughter of God, for mocking her. But of course, being a saint, I forgave the man. He in turn repented and changed his way, worshipping me as the true child of God. Now I'll be honest with you, I was ecstatic, utterly elated. I felt like I was on top of the world, and I reveled in it. The villagers showered me with adulation. They revered me, the daughter of God. Anyone who didn't was punished, and on top of that, my blood could cause miracles. Tell me, do you look down on me for feeling the way I did? The actual child of God would never let himself be consumed by such base emotions, would she? Oh, I thought she was talking about Jesus Christ. No. The actual child of God would never let herself be consumed by such base emotions, would she? But if you would give me a chance, I would like to explain myself. I was but a young girl at the time, and to a child, her mother is the world. Anything she says is the absolute truth. So when my mother's claims so happened to coincide with a lucky miracle, my young mind was set in stone. I was a saint. My blood could heal the sick, and nothing could convince me otherwise. After all, I was but a girl of 6 years old. It is not my place to decide whether my blood truly had miraculous powers or not. If you think it did, then it did, and if you think it was all happenstance, then so it was. Miracles are brought about by faith. So the elderly woman who is healed was done so by the power of her own belief. Baseless hope and desire can, at times, make the otherwise impossible reality. You understand just how major a role religion played in our time, don't you, Michelle? Especially as someone whose life was taken from him in the name of God. And you understand how powerful word of mouth can be as well, don't you? It didn't take long for word of the miracle-performing child of God to spread. Travelers from faraway lands came to our village, all in search of aid. Driven by a mixture of elation and duty, I gave my blessings unto every pilgrim who sought them. I gave my blood, yes. I gave them my blood, yes. My young hands were perpetually covered in wounds. Running out of skin on my fingers, I cut the back of my hands, my palms, my wrists. Before long they had turned into swollen, carved-up black and red horrors, and so I kept them wrapped in cloth at all times. The only time I uncovered them was to give blood to those who sought it. My lacerated hands were, in no uncertain terms, gruesome and unsightly, but the believers who came to see me all wept at my selfless sacrifice. And so I came to cherish those wounds. There were some for whom no miracle took place, but whenever that would happen, the villagers would come out and say, "The daughter of God is not to blame. You simply lack sufficient faith." Thus, such incidents had no negative effect on my reputation as a saint. For 3 years I continued doling out blessings. One day, while I was offering a prayer, my mother let slip her discontent. "Why must thou—" I don't know where the thou came from. "Why must you hand out miracles for nothing? Why must you give strangers grace? We should be getting compensated." I thought it was compensation at first, but then it was a TED, so we should be getting compensated. We deserve remuneration. If we charge just a little bit for each blessing, we could live so much more comfortably. I was dumbfounded. How could the mother of a saint say such things? Helping people was my divine calling, and she expected payment? I nearly wept, hearing my mother preoccupied with such worldly desires. So I explained to her how important this work was. I taught her that we were not to covet material wealth, that we were to dedicate our lives to the service of our fellow man. "You're right, my dear saint," she said, understanding. And I believed her. I fell asleep that night convinced she truly understood that there would be no more problems. But the next day, I was sold off. Men I had never seen before carried me by the arms and tossed me into a carriage. Confused and panicked, I stuck my head out, searching for my mother. Off in the shadow of the house, I saw her with a strange man, accepting a bag of coins. The carriage rocked back and forth as it rolled along a dirt road. Shaking and bouncing with it, I struggled with overwhelming grief and despair. It was perhaps the first time in my life I had felt such a powerful emotion. I didn't know what I felt so much despair over, though. Obviously it was over my present predicament, but I wasn't sure what about it hurt the most. Was it that I had been pawned off like a slave? Was it that my mother, the mother of a saint, had been blinded by money? Was it that the villagers had watched in silence as a disciple of the Lord was thrown into a carriage? Or was it that I, daughter of God, lamented my misfortune like a mortal? I decided it was a trial. My Father, the Lord God, was testing my worthiness of being his daughter. So I choked back my urge to cry and sat there in silent contemplation. For almost 3 weeks I was rocked around in the carriage. The coachman treated me well enough, but I'm certain it was only because he didn't want his precious cargo dying before he could deliver it. He did not by any means think me the child of God. The 3rd week the carriage arrived at a city. It was much larger than the village I had grown up in, with many, many more people crowding the streets. Something about them felt different, too. They all spoke in a tongue foreign to me, which is when I realized I was far, far away from home. I was delivered to the lavishly decorated mansion of the region's lord. Brightly colored flowers bloomed wildly in the garden as guests laughed and ate extravagant meals. And in addition to them, there were probably 4 times as many slaves moving about the grounds, getting a range of looks from everyone we passed, from smartly dressed men to scrawny, emaciated servants. I was led to the Lord's chambers. The Lord was surrounded by beautiful women. Perhaps they were slaves, or perhaps they were prostitutes, I couldn't tell. Among them were some girls hardly older than me. They all wore thin swaths of cloth, barely covering themselves at all. The Lord looked up and down, and he said The Lord looked me up and down, and with a laugh he said, "Welcome, daughter of God. You'll be performing miracles for me now." Miracles are not something to be performed for one single person's benefit, I replied, shocked and furious he had just said something so utterly blasphemous. In response, he said, "I bought you. You are my property. You have no right to an opinion." But I would not have any of it. I entreated him to give up his indulgent lifestyle and devote himself to the service of the Lord. But the more I pleaded, the deeper the creases on his face grew. Thinking back on it now, it was hardly surprising. A 9-year-old girl was scolding the most powerful man in the region. I believed it was my duty, and that I was only doing what was right, but he shortly saw it as incredible arrogance. So the Lord forced his will upon me. He bound my hands and my feet and cut me without my permission, filling a goblet with my blood and passing it around to his guests. A saint's blood and good fortune to all. That was when I realized the Lord was only interested in the approval of others. He reveled in their envy as he pranced about, showing off his curious new toy, me. He didn't need my miracles. Neither he nor any of his guests were afflicted with disease or misfortune. They were all richly blessed. Every time he threw a banquet, he drained me of my blood. It became nearly impossible to find a spot on either of my arms that wasn't swollen, reddish. It became nearly impossible to find a spot on either of my arms that wasn't a swollen, reddish-black gash. And soon, because my arms weren't providing enough blood for him, the cutting spread to my legs. I lived in a haze of half-consciousness. Honestly, I'm amazed it didn't kill me, though perhaps the Lord was simply taking care not to take more than my body could spare. Watching the wealthy partygoers laugh and sip my blood. Watching the wealthy partygoers laugh and sip my blood through bleary eyes, another wave of despair came over me. My miracles, my blood, were not meant to be an appetizer at a feast. They were meant for the sick and the poor. But despite my wishes, the Lord persisted to squeeze me dry day in and day out for his own enjoyment. For a while I was convinced it was all God's test, that it was part of his plan for me, his daughter, that if I could make it through this trial, I would be allowed to go back to helping people. That man would celebrate my success, envy me, worship me, that sinners would face punishment, that divine retribution would be delivered unto all who had wronged me, a saint. With each passing day, my spirit grew more twisted. Would anyone have believed that scarred and bloodied girl tied up on the floor in the banquet hall was a saint? Unlikely. This was no charitable gathering. but an unholy Sabbat. Perhaps it was caused by my corrupted spirit. Perhaps it was my heart's way of crying for help. Or perhaps it was the devil giving me my witch's mark. But no matter what the case, during one of the bloody banquets, I underwent a transformation. I was half conscious, as usual, when one of the guests pointed at me and shouted something. His face went pale, as if he were afraid, which I found quite curious. The Lord then approached me, grabbing me by the hair and lifting my head. He yelled something, but I was too far gone to be able to make out what he was saying. Suddenly I found myself released from my bonds. But my body had grown so weak from being tied up for so long, I didn't have the strength to hold myself up, and so I collapsed to the floor. I was still trying to figure out what was happening when the Lord drew a sword, raising it high above his head. His words in that moment reached me with perfect clarity. "You're a damned witch wearing a saint's skin." A witch? Why was he calling me a witch? I was the holy daughter of God. I had certainly never made a pact with the devil. What could have given him that idea? What was in store for me now? Had God performed some kind of miracle for him? Dozens of thoughts and questions floated through my mind as death hung over me. I couldn't comprehend anything, and so I didn't feel any fear or anger at my impending death. I was simply curious. What had happened to me? But before I had a chance to find that answer, the Lord swung down his blade. Without warning, without any time to prepare, the darkness drains away. And a second later, I crash into the stairs, hard. Right at my ear, I can hear the hiss of the river of blood. The world fades in and out of view, giving way to very real images of a past I never lived. I can practically feel the fire in the eyes of that mad blood banquet's guests. Wait. Oh, yeah. My vision distorts. I can't regain my focus. Whose blood is this streaming down the stairs? Is it hers? Is it mine? Who am I? A saint? A witch? Is what I'm seeing through a lens of clarity or madness? Wait, no. I am not her. I am Michelle, no one else. Oh, it hurts, doesn't it? It's hard to breathe. Your chest is on fire. Your vision is blurry. It's dark. It's lonely. It's scary. It's frustrating. It's disheartening. It's exasperating, isn't it? What you're feeling is exactly the pain I felt. I reach my hand out in plea for help, which is when I see something I can hardly believe. Both of my arms are covered in gashes, blood flowing from them without end. The raw flesh beneath my skin has been exposed to the open air. All I can bring myself to do is scream. That pain, her horrible past, is doing everything in its power to break me. That 9-year-old girl's sickening experiences are twisting and constricting and crushing me. Why is this happening to you? Are you really that slow, my dear? You're empathizing with my pain. You're just that kind-hearted, Michelle. You said you wouldn't give up, didn't you? That you would make your way, to me. Then surely you won't. Then surely this won't be enough to do you in.
Of course it won't. Mustering up every last bit of strength I can, I begin crawling up the stairs. The red river beats against my open wounds, stinging painfully. The simple act of lifting an arm or a leg is almost unbearably agonizing. The blood dripping from my lacerated arms mixes with the blood already soaking in the tower. So this is the pain Morgana suffered. Do you despise everyone, Morgana? Did your resentment at your mother's betrayal, at the people who came seeking your blood, at the Lord who took your life, turn into hatred for all mankind?
Your perception of me is still incorrect, Michelle. My grudge is only against a select few. Think about it, my dear. Of the thousands, millions, billions of people living on this planet, my world is comprised of but a minuscule fraction of that. Hatred for all mankind? No, what I feel is not nearly so nebulous. Although if I had died still believing I was a saint, maybe I wouldn't have such a well-defined mission.
Are you saying the Lord didn't kill you?
Oh my, did you actually think that was the end of my tale? Despite all your big talk, you're afraid of having to suffer through any more of that, aren't you? But you're the one who said you wouldn't give in. So go on. Know my pain without losing your mind.
Once again, my surroundings crumble. I have no say. I have no chance to object before I'm dragged back to that repulsive banquet. I reach out, stretching my hand as far as it will reach, but all I can grab is darkness. My bloody body sinks back into the abyss. The pain becomes more than just a memory, eroding away at my consciousness.
You're a damned witch wearing a saint's skin. Maybe if I had died then, I wouldn't have become the witch you know now. But that's all conjecture. Theorizing about what could have happened is an exercise in futility. But no, I did not die that day. Brought together by constant mistreatment, the Lord's slaves chose that moment to start their revolt. When he swung down his blade, someone bumped into him and it was knocked off its course. I didn't have the strength to get to my feet, so I simply watched the chaos unfold before my hazy eyes. It never even occurred to me that I should try to escape. At some point during the riot, a young man, one of the slaves, grabbed me by my bloody, limp arm and led me out of the Lord's manor. The young man brought me to a slum, a place where the people banded together in their hardship, barely scraping together enough to eat every day, let alone pay the taxes demanded of them. By the time we had arrived at a small brothel By the time we had arrived at a small brothel located a ways into the slum, the fog was starting to clear from my mind. I knew where we were, the feeling the gazes of those And feeling the gazes of those scantily clothed women, I trembled. In a sense, that was possibly the most frightened I had been in my life, despite everything else I had been through. The idea that I had fallen so far I would have to become a prostitute scared me to death. After all, I was a saint, and saints were supposed to retain their purity. Spreading my legs for any man who gave me enough coins would shatter my very identity. As all that was going through my mind, I probably shouted no in protest, because the slave gave me an exasperated look and told me he hadn't brought me here to become a prostitute. He said he knew someone here, someone I could trust, and that she would give me a room. I had trouble believing him, though. I couldn't trust the word of a prostitute, someone who valued money more than her own body. It was all a trap, I was sure. One day, they would tell me I had to work. Nothing he said would convince me otherwise. Apparently sensing my mistrust, the slave gave me an apologetic frown and handed me a mirror, saying, "Even if I did, you couldn't get any work looking like that." I could not believe what I saw. That couldn't be my face. It had to be an illusion. There was no way. That was not the face of a saint. It couldn't be. It wasn't real. It wasn't possible. Patches of skin had fallen off my face, exposing the raw, red flesh beneath. It looked quite similar to what had been done to my arms and legs, except my face had never been cut before. Looking at myself in the mirror, even I doubted my own sainthood. The thing in my reflection was a hellish abomination. It was the twisted face of a witch. And although I was shocked by what I saw, at the same time, it answered several lingering questions. It explained why the Lord and his guests had panicked at the sight of me, and it also explained why he said I was a witch wearing a saint's skin. Over the course of the dozens of banquets I had participated in, my face must have mutated, twisted into this ugly, sickening, monstrous thing. The sight of what I had become sapped the last bit of willpower from me, not because I was particularly fond of my face or thought myself especially beautiful, but because it crushed me to see everything saintly about me crumble away. Test from God or otherwise, I didn't have the strength left to attempt to overcome it. Deciding I would rather be dead than struggle any longer, I begged the slave to kill me. Taking one's own life was a sin. If I did that, I would not be able to return to my father's side, and I wanted to ask him why I had been put through such tribulation. But the young man refused. He said, completely missing my intention, that if I persevered, good fortune would eventually find me. He said that if I lived on, I would eventually have the chance to get my payback. I had no such worldly concerns, though, for if no one would take my life, I had no choice but to live. I despised life at the brothel. The men who came to buy their services were disgusting buffoons, the kind of people who would think they could deceive God. And the women fawning over them were just as repulsive. That said, I had nowhere else to go, which meant I was forced to suffer that sickening place. By the time a year or so had passed, my feelings about it had changed. The women of the brothel took good care of me, treating me like a sister. At first it was just irritating. I was a saint, and how could a saint have prostitutes for sisters? But over time I got to know them better, grew to appreciate their circumstances and hardships. Despite barely having enough money to keep food on the table, whenever they had a little to spare, they would use it to purchase medicine. Ointments to apply to my legs, to my arms, legs, and face. And as a result of their generosity, my arms and legs started looking almost human, but nothing had any effect on my face. Occasionally, the slave would drop in to check on me. The other men thought me ghastly and wouldn't get anywhere near me, but he was different. And every time he visited, he would say, "One day I'll show you the world." And to tell you the truth, I was beginning to grow attached to it all. My time at the brothel was probably, all things considered, one of the brighter chapters of my life. There I was neither saint nor witch, but an ordinary human girl. For the first time, I felt like my life had meaning beyond my assumed divine purpose. I was even beginning to feel kind of happy. And with each passing day, my intractable worldview was gaining a little flexibility. Perhaps I could perform miracles, but that didn't necessarily mean I had to be the daughter of God or a saint. Maybe I was just a regular person who happened to possess some unusual abilities. Ridiculous, isn't it? Despite coming to accept my humanity, I refused to let go of my miraculous powers. They were the last thing protecting what I thought of as myself. But to me at the time, it felt like a very dramatic change of heart. 3 years after the revolt at the Lord's Manor, I had my 12th birthday, for which they threw me a little dinner party. The women all pitched in to bake me treats, and the young slave man was there too. I was happy. I thought that if life could continue on like this, I was fine with not going back to being a saint. But for some reason, happiness always seemed to slip away as soon as you've got your hands around it. No one sincerely wants to lose it, so why must they? I certainly didn't mind not being miserable. Let me tell you what happened that night. On the night of my birthday celebration, bandits attacked the brothel. Now, bandits were hardly a rarity in that time, so everyone was always on the lookout. But we never went out at night. They wouldn't stop at robbing you either. They were armed with blades and would frequently kill their targets if necessary. But cautious as we were helpless against a direct raid. The brothel fell into a panic, screams echoing in the night. The customers were carved up and left for dead. The women were bound and stowed away to be sold. My peaceful world shattered in an instant. And the next thing I knew, I was some slave trader's merchandise. I don't know what became of the prostitutes who cared for me or the slave who brought me to them. I assume the women were sold and the young man slaughtered. But regardless, I found myself being rocked around in the back of a carriage once more. The carriage was packed so tight you could barely see the floor, and it smelled like death. Sweat, urine, feces, every foul odor imaginable compressed into a tiny space. There were both men and women there, nearly all of them muttering or groaning or weeping. Everyone was young, ripe to be put to work. Everyone was young, ripe to be put to work. It didn't take me long to realize what fate awaited these people, and me. And when I did, I just sat there in silence. Then, for the first time, I cried. I was experiencing, I believe, a very human emotion. I was sad, hurt that I had been taken away from a place where I was happy, from the women at the brothel and that young man. It crushed me, and no longer did I wonder why such a thing was happening to the holy daughter of God. Something about my tears must have seemed strange to him, because one man saw me and said, "Why are you crying?" He was a curious man. To start, he looked very different from anyone else. The color of his skin, the length of his nose, the shape of his eyes. Everything about him was new and unusual. Hesitantly, I replied, "I'm sad because I didn't get the chance to show my gratitude to people very dear to me." The man fell silent, looking as though he was deep in thought. I had no idea why he had asked me that, but something about him made me uncomfortable, so I couldn't bring myself to ask. Several hours later, the man suddenly stood up. The guards had no patience for anyone stepping out of line, and they didn't look like they would hesitate to kill us either. So unsurprisingly, one at the back of the carriage drew his sword and pointed it at the man. What was surprising, though, was what happened next. The man, his hands shackled like the rest of us, leapt for the guard, slamming his fists into his face and stealing his sword. The entire carriage was in shock. The guards were too stunned to effectively react, so they were quickly cut down. And because the one-man uprising had taken place between cities, there was no one the slave traders could ask for help before they were slaughtered. In the blink of an eye, it was all over, and there was nothing human about what I had witnessed. If I had to describe it, I would say it was as though a wild beast had attacked. The man ruffled through the slave trader's clothes until he found the keys, which he then brought to me, ordering I unshackle him. And so I did as he commanded. Once they had enough time to process what had happened, the would-be slaves applauded. Their wretched souls had been saved, and for a moment I believed so too. When the man's hands were free, he rolled his shoulders a couple times, made sure everything was in place, and then he began his massacre. Screams of agony filled the carriage as he ran his sword through the helpless men and women packed inside it. Blood and guts were splattered against every surface, and those who tried to escape did not get far before being mercilessly skewered. It was like a scene out of a nightmare. I was frozen in place, not out of fear, but because my mind had shut down. I couldn't make sense of what was happening, so my mind rejected it. And with my brain having given up, my body was no more than a lifeless puppet. In short order, all the slaves were dead, and I was sitting in a pool of blood staring at the man. He pointed his blade at me, and with a little smirk said, "Why didn't you run?" In turn, I asked him, "Why did you kill them?" The smile vanished from his face, and after a few moments of pondering, he replied, "Because I felt like it." "And why haven't you killed me yet?" I asked. To which he gave a curt, "I don't know," then withdrew his blade and wandered off into the distance. And then I was all alone, surrounded by corpses. I glanced down, and half of someone's face was looking back up at me.